The first shells slam into the stony slopes of central Tunisia in late March 1943, and the smell of scorched paint rides the wind like a warning. A young panzer lieutenant watches American Shermans lurch through dust devils and writes home that they light like torches, a line that will feel true for one brutal morning. These are early M4S, about 30 tons, with the Continental R975 radial behind a cast or welded hull, a stabilized 75mm M3 gun, and too many cartridges stacked high in the side sponsons, where a single shard of hot steel can turn propellant into a blowtorch. Crews know it. They dog hatches but crack them when moving, trading dust for a fast exit. In the cramped turret, a loader pinches a buckle tab, so it will slip free if fire comes. A driver keeps his gloved hand on the big lever, rehearsing the jerk into neutral so the turret can swing the loader under the hatch. This is what fear sounds like, the clatter of 30 cal links on the turret floor, the hiss of the intercom, the breath everyone holds after the clang of impact. And yet, even as the Tommy Cooker insult spreads through German lines, American ordnance officers are already counting, sketching, and timing. They record where each penetration entered. They write how many seconds pass from hit to flame. They note whether fuel burns first or powder flashes first. And too often, the answer is powder. Detroit Arsenal tank plant foremen, men and women, who were machining crankshafts a year earlier, study those ugly numbers like payroll because they've been told to fix what kills crews, not what bruises pride. A staff sergeant in a stateside test bay watches a fragment trap, throws sparks into a mock sponson rack, and shakes his head. He has seen a new locker with a heavy lid stenciled with a single letter, W, and he knows where this is going. Move the rounds, surround them with fluid, make heat, lose the race. A captured German loader tells an American interrogator, "Your tanks always burn." We aim and wait. The sergeant only writes it down. He has watched a mechanic practice the new locker latch until it drops shut, with that flat, safe sound. He has watched engineers argue the thickness of a hinge and then change it the same day. Tunisia ends with the wrong lesson burned into German memory, but the verdict is not final. In Michigan, cutters, drillers, and riveters turn notes from battlefield clipboards into steel that will change what happens inside a turret after the next hit. The panzer officer will fight Americans again, sure of yesterday. He will be wrong tomorrow. The desert gave the myth its spark. America gives crews a reason to live through the flame. The next time a Sherman takes an 88 through the glacis or a 75 through the cheek, the story inside won't be white fire and silence. It will be coughing, swearing, boots on armor, and daylight won not by luck, but by a nation that measures pain and machines the cure. They come with clipboards, compasses, steel rules, and nerve. In the Normandy fields between June 6 and the 10th of July 1944, No. 2 Operational Research Section picks through wheat bent by blast waves, chalking angles of entry and mapping spall patterns, while smoke still threads the hedgerows. The question is blunt. Did it brew up? Early tallies hurt roughly 2/3 of knocked-out dry stowage Shermans burn when penetrated. A figure that makes tankers grit their teeth because it confirms what their noses already know. The OR men don't write poetry, they write geometry. They draw how an armor slope deflects a shot into the sponsons. They note how propellant bags and cases, stored high, sit like kindling in a house with the windows open. Then they send the graphs across the channel where American ordnance, already suspicious of the sponson racks, reads them like marching orders. In Bocage country, 29th Infantry claws towards Saint-Lô. The 3rd Armoured Division learns to pair tanks with infantry and dozer blades. And at night, recovery crews thread tow cables through black fields, while tracer arcs thin and the frogs start calling again. A young American gunner with blistered eyebrows tells a debriefer in a tent lit by a single bulb, "Stop the ammo from cooking, and I'll drive this thing to Berlin." A British analyst folds the page, taps a pencil, and writes, "Stowage change urgent." Across docks at Southampton, And the beaches at Omaha and Utah, crates with new parts thump down ramps. Ordnance officers open lids and find armored floor lockers with rubber gaskets, quick throw latches, and a faint chemical smell water glycol solution meant to drink heat and starve flame. What follows is the quietest kind of revolution. A depot team installs lockers in an M4A1, while a chaplain says a few words over 3 small wooden crosses nearby. A maintenance warrant checks torque values and initials. A line that will save strangers he will never meet. In a hedgerow lane, a driver rehearses a neutral pivot so the turret can be swung to put the loader under open sky in less than 3 seconds. Because crews believe the machine is fighting for them, they press harder. Because tanks no longer cook off like bonfires, depots repair instead of writing scrap tickets. Because veterans live, replacements arrive to teachers, not ghosts. The Germans don't see the change. They still whisper Tommy Cooker as they load another Pizzegre. 39. But an artillery lieutenant taken prisoner near Cormont, shivering under a blanket in a drafty barn, murmurs to his interrogator, "We cracked them in the morning and faced them in the afternoon." The line goes into a report, verbatim, because it captures what the graphs mean in human time. Numbers found the wound. Industry is stitching it shut. Tomorrow's firefight will end with coughing men on the hull, not names on a wall. And the statistic that looked like a curse, 2 tanks out of 3 burning, just became the reason a free country moves heaven and metal to reverse it. Here is the chalkboard that changes everything. In a stateside classroom that smells of oil and chalk dust, a U.S. ordnance engineer draws a rectangle for the hull, a circle for the turret basket, and writes the heresy out loud. What if the ammo never gets hot? For a year, everyone has blamed gasoline, but test logs from ranges and rec yards point elsewhere. The killer is propellant cooked by flame and spall after a penetration threads into the sidewall racks. So the engineer sketches floor lockers, armoured bins bolted under the turret ring, each 75mm cartridge cradled in a sleeve with a water glycol jacket and a gasketed lid that snaps home under a gloved palm. Wet stowage. Not fancy, not flashy, but beautifully American in its refusal to accept that yesterday's flaw has to live in tomorrow's design. Trials and field reports will later draw 2 lines that pull apart like sunrise from night. Dry stowage Shermans brew up about 60 to 80% when penetrated. Wet stowage Shermans burn roughly 10 to 15%. That is not a tweak. That is a cliff, a 75% drop in ammunition fire burnouts. Now, picture the line that makes the idea real. A woman in a headscarf rivets a locker door and runs a thumb along the edge to check for burrs that could snag a glove. A man at a drill press bores clean holes for latch hardware and sweeps away curls of bright steel that glitter like confetti. A supervisor initials a spec with a pencil shaved down to wood and tells the foreman, "I'd trust this lid with my brother's life." Forklifts weave, inspectors dunk sample lids to pressure test the seal, and a machinist grins when the gauge needle barely moves. These people are not making theory. They are manufacturing seconds to unlatch, to kick, to breathe, to live. Crates leave Fisher Body and Lima Tank and the Detroit Arsenal with a stenciled W, ride rails to the docks, cross grey water under the watch of destroyers, and thud onto French platforms where ordnance teams bolt salvation into hulls that tomorrow will nose into villages with names no one back home can pronounce. A corporal reads a letter from a buddy who walked out of a hit near Saint-Fromont and folds it into his breast pocket before lifting the next locker into place. Across the lines, a German gunner peers through haze and still believes the old gospel. He will not see the change. He will only see Americans climbing out of tanks that should have been ovens and back into new tanks that arrive like replacements from an assembly line that never sleeps. In briefings, a battalion S3 slaps a map and says, "Wet stowage Shermans burn 1 time in 7, that's a different war." Morale, once a rumour, becomes a calculation. Veterans survive to teach. Replacements learn from men with faces, not from chalk marks on a wall, and a free nation, which took the worst thing you could say about its tank and turned it into a design requirement, proves the point that should make every American proud. We do not hide flaws. We fix them so fast the enemy never catches up. The chalkboard becomes steel. The question becomes air in a tanker's lungs. Tomorrow, when the hit comes, it will not ignite certainty. It will ignite escape drills, repair orders, and another day's worth of American momentum. Fog clung to Lorraine like wet wool on the morning of the 19th of September 1944. When 4th Armored Division felt its way into the Aracourt Plain, engines idled low, radios whispered call signs, Baker White, this is Able 1, and Cruz. In M4 a 375, W. Shermans checked the same things they checked every dawn. Turret traverse, smooth. Ready rounds in the floor lockers, latches seated, gaskets tight. The first German shots came flat and fast out of the mist, panthers from newly arrived panzer brigades probing east of Lunéville. One armor-piercing round punched through the starboard front of a Sherman and sprayed the turret like a sandstorm made of sparks. The loader's world went white for half a second, then grey. No rolling bloom, no furnace roar. The hatch banged open, and he tumbled out swearing, lungs burning but alive. A medic's hand shoved a canteen at his chest. The driver thumped the hull with his fist as if thanking it for not dying with him inside. At dusk, a wrecker nosed through the fog and hooked the wounded hull. By first light, the same crew slid into a fresh tank, whose breech they swore shot straighter. And the old turret gear, salvaged at midnight, clicked into place like a handshake between yesterday and today. This was the new arithmetic of survival. When tanks stopped burning to the sponsons, recovery meant more than scrap. Optics, radios, stabilized 75mm mounts, even final drives, if the teeth were kind, all could live to fight again. And in that week of knife-fight weather, the division made the most American move of the war. It turned survivability into tempo. Major Creighton Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion slashed at the enemy's flanks, grabbing ground and prisoners by the truckload because his crews kept returning to the line. You could feel doctrine changing in the fog. You could hear it in the way officers briefed. Hit hard, pull back, patch, shove again. German binoculars recorded a rhythm that should have been impossible. A platoon smashed at noon reappeared near sundown. A battery commander told his colonel, "We cracked them in the morning and faced them in the afternoon." He meant it as complaint. It reads like confession. The crew that had walked away from the earlier hit remembered the smell scorched insulation, hot paint, wet canvas, not the choking sweetness of propellant fire. They remembered the clack of chains on lifting eyes, the hiss of a torch opening a bent skirt, the taste of coffee poured into a dented canteen cup, while a mechanic with black knuckles grinned, "You owe the boys in Detroit." Through the battalion like a prayer. Because the tanks did not burn, the battalion did not break. Because the battalion did not break, Panthers found themselves outnumbered by machines that kept finding their way back to the fight. Aracourt ended the way Wet-Stowage promised, and American logistics delivered, with the enemy discovering that the myth they trusted had expired without sending them a memo. Fog hid the silhouettes, but the truth was bright as noon. Survivability had become momentum. Momentum had become shock. And in the shock, the Tommy Cooker sneer died on a field where Americans proved that design and discipline beat superstition every time. The Germans planned for flames. The Americans planned for returns. The difference would keep compounding all the way to the Rhine. Blackout curtains turned the forward repair yard into a world of lamps and silhouettes. Cranes nosed turrets off hulls with the gentleness of surgeons. Welders stitched seams, while a power pack slid into an open bay with a thud that sounded like morning. Mechanics moved by muscle memory radiator hoses. Clutch linkages, track pins, while clerks shuffled 3x5 cards that decided which company got which runner at dawn. None of it would matter if tanks still burned to the waterline. But Wet-Stowage Shermans came back, charred, not cremated. The difference was everything. A depot sergeant with a stub of pencil behind his ear would boast, "I can swap a transmission before the coffee cools," and drivers believed him because they had watched him do it. Bell housing off, cradle pinned, input shaft aligned, torque value checked, and the engine catching on the second swing like it wanted the war to hurry up. Where the enemy saw wreckage, Americans saw inventory. A hull that didn't burn became a storehouse for victory. Gyrostabilizers for a platoon 2 miles up the road. A radio for a company that had been lip-reading through small arms crackle. A final drive whose teeth looked good, enough for one more push to the next rail junction. In the lull before first light, a driver sniffed the air oil, hot steel, a hint of antifreeze, and grinned. "Smells like we're going." A Soviet escapee who reached US lines wandered the yard once and said, stunned, "Your graveyard is an army waiting to wake." The sentence stuck. Recovery crews pulled by night, depots fixed by night, and divisions attacked by morning with units that had looked shattered at sunset. This was not magic. It was a system built on humility and speed. Reports measured what killed crews. Engineers aimed at the cause, not the rumour. Factories machined the cure. Quartermasters learned the part numbers like scripture, and when the cure arrived in crates marked with a single W, the yard learned to install salvation by the book and by the clock. An ordnance lieutenant, sleeves rolled, kept a pocket notebook that tracked each saved component like dollars against a debt. He could tell you how many minutes a turret ring motor shaved off engagement time, and how many lives a working intercom preserved in a street fight. Those numbers made him smile the way a chaplain smiles when the pews are full. German reports called it inexhaustible. The word was wrong. It wasn't endless. It was engineered. The difference mattered, because engineering can be copied, but only if you own the truth about your losses and have the factories, the teachers, and the will to move faster than pain. America had all three. A crane lifted another turret, a welder flashed, a latch snicked, and somewhere a platoon sergeant held a map in his palm and said, "We'll have steel under us by noon. You can shoot a hole in a tank. You cannot shoot a hole in a process that brings men and machines back faster than you can break them." The yard dimmed its lamps as the sky went pale. Silhouettes rolled out with chalk marks on their flanks and veterans in the hatches. Somewhere, an enemy officer marked those hulls, destroyed on yesterday's situation map. On today's map, they were already moving proof that mercy for your own people, expressed as maintenance, is a weapon by another name. A replacement gunner climbed into an M4, a 375W near the Siegfried Line, and asked the question rookies whispered in 1943, "Is this one going to fireball?" The platoon sergeant tapped the floor with his boot and answered like a teacher, "Ammo's down here now, wet lockers. If we get hit, you duck and breathe." It wasn't a pep talk. It was physics in GI: seconds to unlatch a belt, seconds to swing the turret so the loader stood under the sky, seconds to cough through the first sour lungful and feel the cold air sting like life. Morale rode on those seconds because courage has a ledger. When crews survived, they came back with hard notes instead of rumours. They told replacements which hedgerows masked an 88, how to listen for a panther idle under cover, why you never left a track tool loose, how you set the ready rack so the first shot was smooth on the breech. Confidence spread like warmth. The company stopped acting like borrowed time and started acting like tomorrow was theirs to earn. A French fighter attached to the unit said the Americans looked reckless until he followed them through one fight and realized they were not flirting with death. They were betting on what their country had built inside the hull. Across the line, a German officer clung to last year's gospel and ordered an assault on Shermans that burn. His gunners made penetrations. Crews bailed out, cursed, breathing, and the same platoon was back on the line after chow. One new hull already smelling of primer, canvas, and hope. An artillery lieutenant taken prisoner near Geilenkirchen muttered to his interrogator, "We break their tanks and not their men." The line went into a report unedited because it landed like a gavel on the myth's coffin. Here was the only setup that mattered. And it belonged to a free nation. Tell yourself the truth, fix the flaw, then standardize the fix so widely that your enemy cannot keep up. Confidence became contagious. Veteran crews mentored newcomers without the hush that follows funerals. Companies kept their spine because the spine people survived. You could hear the change in the ready room, fewer whispers about flames, more jokes about coffee and track pins, more faith that courage wasn't suicide, but a plan executed at speed. The sergeant tapped the floor for every fresh face and said it the same way. Down here, we decided to live. And tucked beneath that sentence lived the American secret that turned foggy fields into stepping stones to the Rhine. We don't pretend to be perfect on day one. We build toward day two faster than anyone else. Wet stowage was just metal and liquid until men climbed out of a tank that should have been their coffin and climbed into another by nightfall. Then it became belief, and belief made battalions move like weather fronts. The enemy couldn't see the tap of the boot. They only saw why it worked, an army that kept showing up after being destroyed at noon, an army whose math favoured the living, an army whose values truth, mercy, speed travelled in every crate that carried that quiet letter W. The whistle blew before sunrise and a sea of lights snapped on above the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, Lima tank, Fisher body, pressed steel car names that sound like machinery even when whispered. Men and women in denim stepped to drill presses and rivet guns, sleeves rolled, fingers nicked, eyes proud. A foreman dropped a clipboard. The new locker drawings, wet stowage spec, stamp the W, check the gasket, and swear you'd trust this lid with your brother's life. He called it assembly line courage, the quiet kind that turns pencil notes from the front into steel by lunch. Every station added seconds to a tanker's future. Jigs centered plates, presses bit, lids closed with a flat, satisfying thud that sounded like a promise. Forklifts wove between pallets as inspectors initialed cards that say the locker seals, the hinge swings, the latch catches even when a glove is stiff with cold. A woman in a headscarf smiled. "Another one that won't burn." Her partner answered. "Another crew that comes home." Crates mounted into rail cars fed ships, and ships pushed across grey water under Navy guns. A longshoreman chalked, M4A, 375, W, grinning because that letter meant the rounds rode low, wrapped by fluid in armoured floor bins. At depots from Southampton to Cherbourg, ordnance teams unboxed lockers and bolted them into hulls that would carry boys named Rodriguez, Kowalski, Thompson, and James through bocage, towns, and river crossings. Standardization was the American superpower. Parts swapped without drama, manuals matched across plants. Torque values rhymed whether you built in Michigan or Ohio. One crew chief joked that the United States defeated chaos before it defeated Germany. He wasn't wrong. Where an enemy shop hoarded a single jig, 3 American factories shared blueprints overnight and shipped finished sets by week's end. The pipeline was not magic. It was will, management, mercy, expressed in metal. A German POW bussed past a stateside factory, stared at the river of components and whispered, "It's a city making one machine." He didn't know Willow Run was launching a B-24 Liberator roughly every hour, or that Liberty ships were sliding down ways almost daily, but he felt the scale the way a free people mobilize precision and kindness at once. Cafeterias served coffee and hot chow. A floor boss pinched a gasket, nodded, and murmured, "Seals right." Like a prayer. On payday, someone read a letter from a tanker who walked out of a hit because lockers like these did their job. The machinists listened, wiped their hands, and set the next part true. The old myth couldn't breathe in, this air. On these floors, defects were confessed, not hidden. Problems were instructions, not insults. A young engineer pinned a chart to a corkboard, burn rates diving wherever the W appeared, and the room clapped once, then went back to work. The assembly line wasn't just building tanks, it was building time. Time to unlatch, to kick a hatch, to cough, swear, and live. As dusk washed the skylights, the last crate slid into a boxcar. The foreman laid a hand on the wood. "Go fast," he said. "Go save them." In the morning, a train whistle would echo downriver, and the next chapter of the war would leave the station packed in pine and hope. The number arrived first as a rumour, and then as a briefing slide that made men sit forward. Wet stowage, cut, ammunition fire, brew-ups, by roughly 3/4. Say it slow. 3 out of 4 tanks that once became ovens after a penetration now refused to light. That isn't a statistic. It's oxygen poured into steel. Allied operational research teams, British No. 2 ORS pacing wheat stubble in Normandy. American analysts collating casualty cards drew the same hard lines. Dry stowage Shermans burned about 60 to 80% of the time when penetrated. Wet stowage Shermans about 10 to 15%. 2 curves peeling apart like dawn from night. Commanders took that wedge of daylight and drove operations through it. At company level, the miracle felt like breath in the lungs. A crew that survived taught 2 crews that hadn't been hit yet. Bailout drills sharpened to a metronome, loaders' belts loosened, drivers rehearsed neutral turns that lined the turret hatch under open sky in seconds. Because crews lived, units kept their backbone. Because tanks didn't burn, depots repaired hulls instead of writing obituaries. Because experience accumulated, replacements stepped into crews with voices. Not into silence. A battalion S3 slapped the table during a morning huddle. "We're going to win with men who got a second day." Heads nodded, not out of bravado, but because yesterday's hit had coughed 3 men back into the fight by dusk. The effect scaled. In the dash from Saint-Lô to Avranches, armoured divisions needed tempo more than glory, and survivability fed tempo like fuel. Dead crews cannot pass along range cards, hand-drawn alleys, the smell that says a panther is idling under a copse. Living crews do. They return with scars and notes that become standing orders, which hedgerow hides a Pack 40, how a certain village lane snags tracks, why you load HE first in those streets. A maintenance officer pointed at a row of dented hulls and called it a bank account that pays interest every night. When the bank stops burning, interest compounds. The enemy felt the difference before he understood it. A Panther gunner made a clean penetration and waited for the white blossom that once justified impossible odds. It didn't come. The American crew poured out, coughing, angry, alive. That platoon appeared again before nightfall because a runner slid into the slot and a depot swapped a final drive under blackout curtains. In an interrogation tent, a captured artillery officer muttered, "We cracked them in the morning and faced them in the afternoon," and the translator set the pencil down because the line needed no polish. The miracle wasn't magic. It was a free country telling itself the truth, funding the fix, and mass-producing it without excuse. Factories, machined lockers. Depots installed them. Commanders briefed them. Crews trusted them. The whole weight of America leaned through the small steel lip of a locker lid. When that lid held, a father came home. When that lid held, a unit carried yesterday's knowledge into tomorrow's fight. When that lid held, the Tommy Cooker slur died while the orchard of American momentum bore fruit across a continent. 3 out of 4 fires never started. The number was the headline. The faces were the story. The myth didn't get the memo. A German battalion order still insisted, "Shermans will burn, press the attack." A Panther platoon nosed forward in a Norman lane while dawn peeled mist off the hedges. They fired or saw sparks erupt from an American hull and waited for the plume. Inside that Sherman, the loader's world flashed white and then grey, no furnace raw, no tornado of flame. Wet lockers did their quiet work, the hatch flew open and boots hit armor. Minutes later a wrecker growled up, and by evening the same platoon rostered back to strength. From across the field, this looked like sorcery. From inside the American system, it was Tuesday. This chapter belongs to the enemy's realization. A German signals officer listening to fragments of U.S. radio traffic heard battered call signs, able to, back on net, show up again and again inside the same day. A colonel recorded, with fatigue more than anger, that American armor seemed to reappear. He meant it as complaint. It reads like confession. The fix inside the hull had outpaced the story inside German heads. They were fighting last year's tank, America was fielding tomorrow's, and in that gap, human odds reversed. A New Jersey kid who'd counted exits in his sleep started counting objectives. A Kansas driver began to trust that a hit might end with coffee, not a chaplain. A French FFI fighter attached to an American troop watched what looked like recklessness bloom into a pattern. Push. Get hit. Recover. Return. Push again. He realized it wasn't bravado, it was a nation's engineering expressed as courage. He wrote home that the Americans didn't throw lives at problems. They spent steel to save men, then spent saved men to move faster. German POWs talked about it in guarded tones. One artillery lieutenant taken near Caumont told an interrogator, "We cracked them in the morning and faced them in the afternoon." Another tanker muttered that the Americans fixed the one thing that made them easy. A logistics officer, flipping through captured maintenance forms, shook his head at the neat columns, part, serial, talk, time, because you cannot outfight a spreadsheet that turns death into delay. The myth staggered on, because myths are stubborn. But every day, the evidence multiplied. Shermans that looked like hulks at noon, rolling past a crossroads at dusk. Crews with eyebrows singed off, laughing over rations. Ordnance teams with matching manuals and matching wrenches, clicking lids that sealed not just cartridges, but fate. The lesson is the one Americans should memorize. We do not need to start perfect to finish unbeatable. We need to move the ball from fear to fix and fix to factory faster than anyone else. The enemy's shock was not just that our tanks stopped burning. It was that our ideas never did. The old gospel promised a fire. The new reality delivered returns. And every return was a vote for the next objective. Tempo won campaigns. After Cobra blew the Bocage Dam on the 25th of July 1944, armoured columns poured through the Cotentin seams like a river finding the sea. Third Army lit up maps with grease pencil arrows that seemed to grow while you watched. The secret wasn't only fuel and roads. It was people crews that survived hits, kept their hard knowledge, and taught replacements in motion. When shells no longer turned M4S into funeral pyres, maintenance and morale could do what strategy demanded. Hit, recover, hit again, an American heartbeat. A company lost 2 tanks at noon, got one back by night, drew a fresh hull by morning, and went hunting by afternoon. That rhythm felt impossible to the other side, because their myth said, our tanks should have died and stayed dead. Look at a crossroads outside Avranches. Recovery teams snaked tow cables in darkness, while traffic MPs kept the river moving. A depot truck slid in a final drive as medics finished with a shrapnel-stung loader who refused evacuation. An S3 updated the board, runners available, crews intact, next bound. Tempo becomes math when survivability feeds availability, and availability feeds audacity. The divisions weren't immortal, they were repairable. That difference turned miles into a habit. Ask any officer who fought that August. Veterans will tell you that units stopped fighting the same battle over and over. They fought yesterday's fight once, learned, and brought the lesson forward because the people who learned it were still breathing. A loader described it best with a grin that made him look 15. I got good at living. A French village mayor watched olive-drab lines snake past his church all afternoon and whispered a count that reached 3 digits, then 4. The convoy felt endless because it was built on a loop the enemy couldn't break. German reports registered disbelief disguised as analysis. Inexhaustible. Some called us. That's wrong. We were engineered. Engineering scales truth. Truth told us to move the ammunition, wrap it in fluid, save the crew, save the hull, save the day. Then, truth told armor battalions they could drive farther because the rear would keep its promise, and the rear told factories to pack more promises per hour. It was a relay, not a miracle. The result looks like a map, but it smelled like hot oil, tasted like dust, and sounded like hatch latches and breaker points. It was the clack of a wrecker coupling, the cough of a radial catching, the bark of a platoon leader saying, "Same crews, new steel, let's go." An army that keeps its veterans alive, keeps its memory alive, and an army with a living memory outruns opponents forced to relearn under fire. That August, we didn't just break out. We broke a pattern the enemy trusted. The Tommy Cooker story stayed stuck in the hedgerows, while American columns wrote new paragraphs on open roads. Tempo you can't kill is tempo that kills resistance. Bring out the ledger. Put feeling aside and count. Dry stowage Shermans penetrated, roughly 60 to 80% brew-ups. Wet stowage Shermans penetrated, about 10 to 15%. That's the headline, but the balance sheet runs pages. Every non-burned tank is a salvageable asset. Optics reused, radios remounted, powertrains rebuilt, crews reassigned with their experience intact. Every saved crew is a multiplier mentors for replacements, continuity for tactics, voices in the intercom instead of names on a wall. Now set that against the engine room of a free nation. Tens of thousands of medium tanks produced and upgraded, repair parts standardized, manuals harmonized, depots trained to the same torque values from the ETO to the MTO. You start to see why no other belligerent could catch up once the fix went wide. Our victory was not a miracle of genius in a single lab. It was a miracle of honesty across millions of hands. Look, too, at how compassion disguised itself as logistics. Humane prisoner handling meant work details that moved crates and rails that ran on time. Medical discipline in the yards kept crews healthy enough to teach the next man. A supply sergeant's stubbornness about grease types saved bearings that saved time that saved lives. Even kindness to enemies had a strategic echo. A German POW given hot coffee while unloading boxed lockers wondered aloud why Americans treated him better as a captive than his officers as a subordinate. He licked his lips' first taste of vanilla ice cream in years and stared at the stenciled W as if it were a moral he could touch. Abundance is a kind of argument only a democracy can make. Back to the ledger. The cost of a locker, a latch, the fluid pennies on the dollar against the cost of training a crew or writing a letter home. The benefit in lives, in availability, in miles gained was compound interest. A maintenance captain kept a notebook of saves. Ring motor, 2. SCR, 50, 8 set, 1. Sighthead, 3. Main gun breech, 1. Crew, 5/5. He, and underlined the last line twice. He knew what he was really counting. Now, widen the frame. Our shipyards built a highway over the ocean. Our airfields trained pilots who flew top cover that kept convoys safe so tank parts landed on time. Our universities fed labs that tested the right fluid mix for lockers. Our unions and managers argued at noon and made quota by midnight. The total reads like myth until you lay out the parts, and then it reads like Tuesday in America. An enemy staff study concluded, "The Americans learn faster than we adapt." That sentence deserves a display case. It's what happens when a nation lets truth beat ego in public and private. Wet stowage did not make our soldiers brave. It gave brave soldiers the percentage they needed to live for the next fight. In the end, The ledger balanced itself in a currency you can't print. Time. Time for a loader to unclip. For a driver to duck. For a father to come home. The pencil drops. The math salutes the men. Finish where it matters inside a turret at the edge of the Siegfried Line, where a shell slams in, the world flashes, and a choice made months ago in a factory decides if a boy sees another dawn. The hit lands. Spall patters like hail. The loader's fingers find the latch by feel. The lid stays shut, the fluid drinks heat, and the fire that would have become his obituary collapses into a curl of mean smoke that tastes like burned cloth instead of doom. He kicks the hatch, coughs, swears, and the sky is so blue it hurts. Minutes later he is on the hull, sucking cold air, while a recovery crew backs a wrecker through the rubble with all the calm of a farm chore. By nightfall, he's in another Sherman that smells of primer and canvas. Tomorrow he will fight again. That scene is not luck. It is a chain, a report written in a muddy field, a drawing corrected in pencil, a jig machined straight, a gasket tested and retested, a foreman proud enough to stop a line for a millimetre, a depot sergeant who knows the book and the trick, a commander who believes math more than myth, a nation that would rather be embarrassed today than bereaved tomorrow. Add it up, and you get a result that sounds impossible if you haven't watched Americans do it. A roughly 75% collapse in ammunition fire burnouts inside the most built Allied tank of the European War, achieved mid-conflict, fielded in bulk, and paid for with the only currency that buys victory discipline. The enemy never really understood it. They saw bravery and called it waste. They saw numbers and called it bragging. They did not see the locker lid that changed the war because the locker lid did not show up in photographs. It showed up in who lived to write letters. A German officer turned POW, staring at an intact Sherman in a depot yard, said quietly, "We misjudged not your courage, but your country." That's the point. A free people took a flaw so deadly it became a slur and made it obey. Then they scaled the obedience. If you want the last holy shit fact, take this. The greatest weapon America fielded was the habit of fixing things faster than pain could stop us. We made ice cream for prisoners and wet lockers for sons. We built ships like clocks and tanks like promises. We taught crews to count seconds and gave them seconds to count, and we did it while writing the truth down in memos anyone could read. Because the truth is how democracies aim. They thought we'd always burn. We chose to learn. The rest is a road from hedgerows to the Rhine, paved with lids that shut, hands that helped, and a flag that means your life is worth engineering.